Now I know what my obituary is going to sound like. Thank you all for being here today. You'll forgive me for looking at my notes. I usually have a teleprompter, but we'll make by with what we have here today. It is such an honor to be with you, and if any of you need to come in from the sun and get some shade, we can make some room for you, so please feel free. You know, the journey that brought us all here today started more than 100 years ago with some of the men we honor here today when they were born in big cities and small towns all across America, born into uncertain times that required men and women to step up, leave their lives and families behind, and serve their countries. For reasons, in some cases simple, and in others complex and confusing, when their once cherished lives came to an end, they were left behind to gather dust on the mortuary shelf for decades, forgotten in many ways until now. With their discovery comes our responsibility to give them what they earned, an honors burial. And thankfully, though long overdue, that is what they will finally receive today. Some of their stories defy logic. Among those we honor today, a chemical engineer, a college dean, a successful banker, a construction company owner. Why would their loved ones leave them behind? The answers are as complex as the world in which they lived. Many had no family left, some had lost touch, and their stories might have been lost to time and circumstance for all eternity, if not for the hard work of some of the amazing groups that made today possible. Yeah, occasionally in my line of work, you stumble onto a story that really changes you and redefines your definition of commitment and service to your country. And that happened to me a couple of years ago when I met James Topkoff of the Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 1071. I was transfixed by the story he was telling me, that someone in their group had heard all over the Denver area there were hundreds, if not thousands, of unclaimed cremated remains just sitting on shelves, and many of them had to be veterans. So Jim and his team, now led by the amazing Bill Bridges, have spent the last decade or so working with mortuary after mortuary, cataloging and researching these unclaimed remains, determining who among them are veterans, and making sure they got what they were promised so many years ago when they signed on the dotted line to serve their country, an honorable burial at no cost to themselves as a small repayment for their service. Now, in this case, they had an excellent helper, Peter Morley, who has just recently taken over Stork Morley Funeral Home. He opened his doors to the Vietnam veterans and allowed them to do their work because he knows firsthand the value of honoring veterans. He has veterans in his family. Over the last few months, working with the Vital Records Department, they have worked tirelessly to determine that 13 of the men in front of us today and another 14 honored here just a couple of weeks ago are U.S. veterans who served and sacrificed. It is striking what a team effort it took to get us where we are today. The VBA chapter worked closely with University of Denver history students led by their dedicated professor, Carol Hestowski, to research each of the men in the urns in front of you here. Who were they? What was their life like? Where and when did they serve? Who still cared about them at the end of their lives? And why were they left unclaimed for all those years? Those last two questions were, in most cases, impossible to answer. Now, it's relatively easy to research obituary information. Obituaries usually contain our life's highlights, our careers, accomplishments, passions, service to our country, survivors, if any. What almost never shows up on the tattered pages of those old newspaper obituary pages are the complications, struggles, and choices that may have led to the kind of isolation that left these men, in some cases, with no one who cared for them at the end. What matters now, though, is not the circumstances that led to their abandonment at the end of their lives, but the efforts by those gathered here today to right that wrong. Bill Bridges and his team at the Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 1071, without their tireless work, these ashes would likely never find a home on this beautiful rolling hillside. The University of Denver students, under the tutelage of Carol Hestowski, who were given a real-life assignment, tell us who these men are and what they did for their country. Research that helps tell each of these stories. Peter Morley, and from the funeral home for opening the doors and hearts to this project. Colorado Woodworkers Guild, who on their own time and their own dime donate the skill and material to make these beautiful urns a final resting place befitting the heroes now housed inside them. Colorado Patriot Guard for their respectful escort that brought the urns to the cemetery today. The All Veterans Honor Guard and Rifle Team for carrying out the honors that each of these men have earned. The Honor Bell Team for the solemn tribute they carry out here today and every day at Fort Logan. American Legion Post 180 out of Kingsburg, the Arvada Army Navy surplus, and everyone who played a critical role in paying tribute to these American heroes. God bless you. 2 weeks ago, many of us gathered here in this same spot for a similar ceremony honoring men and women who served their country but had been abandoned for decades. And at that ceremony, we got to witness firsthand the power of this effort. A woman named Stephanie Merkler was seated right over there to finally witness the end of her own father's journey. For nearly 50 years, Norman Merkler, a U.S. Navy veteran who was stationed at Pearl Harbor on the day America was thrust into World War II, had sat on the mortuary shelf unclaimed. For 48 years, she had no idea. He died in 1976 of a heart attack, and she thought her mother arranged for his ashes to be spread at the time, but turns out her devastated mom never had. She was just too crushed by her husband's death and couldn't make those final arrangements. So there he stayed on the shelf where he would still be, if not for the veterans here today who refused to leave any man behind. Stephanie Merkler got to witness her father's honors burial 2 weeks ago, and her story drives home the complicated circumstances that led us here today. Not all of these veterans were abandoned and alone at the end of their lives. Not all had made unfortunate choices. Sometimes it's just confusion, fear, or profound grief that prevents these men from getting what they deserve. Whatever the reason, what an honor it is for me, and I know an honor for all of you too, to be here and bear witness to this final act of service for men whose lives were defined by service. And let me tell you about those men right now. Men like J. Martin Hatfield, born in Fort Morgan, Colorado in 1919. He went on to serve in the Army in World War II and in the Air Force in Korea, and stayed in the Air Force Reserves until 1979. He earned a slew of awards, came home, started a family, and went on to get a chemical engineering degree from the University of Denver, and went on to work in the family business, a mortuary that bore the family name. He died in 1993, but no one claimed his cremains. Maurice Maury Locke Snyder was born in 1913 in Clifton, Texas, the son of an insurance salesman. The family moved to Denver when he was 7. His dad died while on a work trip to California when he was just 16. He graduated from Denver South High School, went to CU Boulder, joined a fraternity, and then decided to volunteer for service in World War II. After the war, he worked in advertising and sales, and on April 7, 1987, at the age of 73, he died at Swedish Medical Center in Inglewood. Walter Henry Dorscher was a sergeant in the U.S. Army during World War II and served before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and all the way till the end of the Japanese surrender. He was born in 1919 in Georgia and lived all over the South and Midwest during his life. He died in 1991. His wife died the very next year, and for some reason, his cremains were never claimed. Kenneth Evans Fowler, or Ken as they called him, was born in 1910 in Montana. He'd already started a family when he was drafted into the Army May 20th, 1942. During World War II, he worked on the Alaskan-Canadian Highway Project, left the service with the rank of major a few months after the war ended, and moved to Evergreen, Colorado, where he worked as a civil engineer. Eventually, he opened his own lumber and construction business. He died in 1991, survived by a son and 7 grandchildren. Thomas Cary Flood, known as Cary, was born in New York City in 1935. His parents divorced when he was young, and he split time between New York and West Palm Beach, Florida. He enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1955 and served in peacetime after the Korean War and before Vietnam. Later in life, he worked as a retail supervisor in Golden, Colorado. He was never married and died March 15, 2011. Paul Berger Stark was born in 1921 in Pennsylvania, the son of Swedish immigrants. In 1942, his brother Perry, who was serving during World War II, was killed in an automobile accident. So Paul joined the Army a few months later, and he served through the end of the war. After the war ended, he married Betty May, and they had the first of 2 children in 1947. He died in 2007 at the age of 86 and has a son who's also buried right here at Fort Logan. Robert Wallace Hunt served in the Army in 2 wars, Korea and Vietnam. He was born in 1933 in Lima, Wisconsin. Twice married, he lived in Denver and Aurora after the war and died July 25th, 2002 at Denver Hospice. John Douglas Raritan Jr. was born in Inglewood, Colorado in 1930. 18 years later, he joined the U.S. Navy and served during peacetime. He was briefly married and had no kids, and he died at a young age, just 55 years old, in January 1986. Donald Eugene Larson was born in 1928 in Wichita, Kansas. The family moved to Colorado when he was a child. In 1946, he enlisted in the U.S. Army and was honorably discharged a year and a half later. But then, in 1950, he was called up for service again in the Korean War. After that, he returned to Pueblo and married. He had 3 sons and a daughter, and he worked as a car salesman. In 1992, just 3 months after his wife died, he died at home from a heart attack at 63 years old. Douglas McNeil Goebel enlisted in the Army during World War II, just 2 months shy of his 18th birthday. He served through the end of the war, and after that he came home, met and married Sally Ann St. John, and they had a son and daughter. He had a very successful career as a banker. He died in 1995 in Denver, and a service was held, but it's unclear why no one ever claimed his remains. Burl Wallace Milligan was born in Des Moines in 1922 and died in Englewood, Colorado in 2013 at the age of 91. He served in the Army in Europe in World War II, and having studied engineering prior to the war, he was enlisted by the colonel to teach calculus to soldiers waiting to come home at war's end. Little did he know that was the beginning of a long and successful career as a professor of mathematics. He met his wife when both were performing in a college musical. He was the male lead, she was the female lead, and they were married for 65 years. He taught at several colleges, including Metro State here in Denver, where he served as the first Dean of Arts and Sciences while also working as a math teacher. Very little is known about Marvin E. Clark other than he was born in Sioux City, Iowa, April 9, 1929, and served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. And George Daniel Reed proudly served in the United States Marine Corps during peacetime. He was born December 24, 1959, and died just a few months ago, November 7, 2023. His cremains came to us today through Denver Hospice. Now, we may never know the path that brought these men here today, but we know after decades of uncertainty, their journey finally ends right here and right now. They may finally rest in peace, knowing that a grateful nation appreciates their service and is forever, ever filled with gratitude. Ronald Reagan famously said, "Some people live an entire lifetime and wonder if they've ever made a difference in the world. A veteran does not have that problem." My prayer is that these men in front of us all today knew that in their lifetime, that their difference was profound, and even at the end of their life, they may have been alone or forgotten or uncared for, that our presence here today is reassurance that they mattered and they still matter.